She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She didn't even cry. When her husband handed her divorce papers and a check like she was an employee being laid off, she simply looked at him, picked up her coat, and walked out into the pouring rain. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd gotten rid of the dead weight. But what Brian Thorne didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the woman he threw away had already built the foundation his entire billion-dollar empire was standing on. And she had the receipts to prove it. Now, 3 years later, he's parking cars in the freezing cold using the name Jules, praying nobody recognizes him. And tonight, she's walking through those same hotel doors, in diamonds, in crimson, glowing, with the man who chose her, and the child Brian never deserved. One look, that's all she gave him. Not anger, not satisfaction, just pity. And that single look destroyed him more completely than any lawsuit ever could. The most powerful revenge isn't fury, it's becoming so undeniably happy that your silence becomes their life sentence. If this story gave you chills, you're not alone. Hit that like button right now so YouTube shows this to someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and ring that bell because every week we bring you stories about women who were underestimated and exactly what happened next.
Red wine bled across the white linen, looking like a fresh wound. "Oh my God, Brian! Look at the mess you made!" Chloe shrieked, jumping back. But Brian couldn't hear her. A roar filled his ears. Pregnant. She was at least 7 months along. He did the math in his head. 6 months since the divorce. The room began to spin. Was the baby his, or had she moved on with a speed that defied belief? It was a question that tore through him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him breathless and utterly paralyzed. Their path to the most exclusive table in the restaurant led them directly past his. He expected Emma to look away, to shrink, to make herself small as she used to. Instead, her eyes met his, and he found nothing there. No fear, no love, just the cold, smooth indifference you'd reserve for a stranger. Adrian Vance leaned in, whispering something that made her laugh. A bright, musical sound Brian hadn't heard in years. They swept past, leaving only the faint scent of jasmine and the undeniable aroma of a life he was no longer a part of. "Wait a minute," Chloe whispered, her eyes narrowed in confusion. "Isn't that your ex-wife? The one you said was kind of plain?" Brian could only stare at the spreading crimson stain on the tablecloth, a perfect symbol of his unrevolving control. "Yes," he said, his voice a hollow echo of someone he used to be. "That's Emma." How could this have happened? The memory of their last day together, a day he had orchestrated with such brutal efficiency, came rushing back with perfect, painful clarity. He had handed her the divorce papers and a check, coldly informing her that she no longer fit into the grand design of his future. He had braced himself for screaming, for tears, for a dramatic scene. But she had done none of those things. She hadn't broken a single dish. She simply looked at him, her eyes filled not with anger, but with a deep, devastating sadness that was far worse. She accepted the end of their lives together with a quiet dignity he hadn't known she possessed. "You will learn the price of this, Brian," she had whispered, her voice steady, despite the storm raging outside and the one he had just unleashed in their home. And then she walked out the door into the pouring rain, leaving him with a fortune, a corporate empire, and a future he suddenly realized was utterly empty. He had convinced himself she was the dead weight holding him back. He was only now beginning to understand that she had been his anchor. The reason for her transformation was now being seated in the private alcove Brian could never reserve. He watched, transfixed, as Adrian Vance, a man who came from old, untouchable money, pulled out Emma's chair. He saw the restaurant staff swarm their table, treating Emma not as a guest, but as royalty. Every gesture was a testament to a world she now belonged to, a world he could see but never enter. She had become so successful, so happy that he was the one left looking in from the outside. But it was the way Adrian looked at her that truly gutted him. It wasn't the possessive glance a man gives a trophy. It was a look of pure, unshielded adoration. And then Adrian's hand came to rest on the curve of her belly, a gesture so possessive, so protective, so fatherly. It sent a fresh wave of nausea through Brian. Whose child was it? The thought was a relentless torment. If that was his heir, he had a right to know. He was Brian Thorne, and people did not keep secrets from him. And so this night had begun, not with a bang, but with a whimper of profound boredom. The chandeliers at Lorraine, rumored to be made of pure diamond, cast a brilliant light on Brian's table. He was celebrating a merger that made him the majority shareholder of Cade Logistics, the pinnacle of his success. He was the genius who had climbed from the rough streets of Chicago to the penthouses of Manhattan, a man who believed he could spin straw into gold, convinced his past was completely behind him. Across from him sat Chloe, a 23-year-old model, scrolling through her Instagram feed. "Put your phone away," he had said, an edge to his voice. She'd perked up only at the mention of his success. "Yay for you, baby," she'd chirped. "Does this mean we can finally buy that villa in Como?" He felt a heavy ache in his soul, the crushing weight of having everything and feeling nothing. "We can buy the entire lake if you want," he mumbled, but the words offered no thrill. Ah, so that's how it was. It all started with Brian. At the height of his power, kicking to the curb the woman who'd proofread his first business plans. He'd done it with just the clothes on her back, certain she was an obstacle to his ascent. And as he sat there, bored with his fiery young mistress and his billion-dollar fortune, he had no idea that the woman he'd discarded was about to become so happy that he would finally understand he was the one who had lost everything. With a guttural roar, Brian hurled his phone against the office wall, watching it explode into 1,000 pieces. He couldn't let his company fail. He was Brian Thorne, a visionary, not some fraud who'd built an empire on his wife's stolen talent. But as he stared out at the city he thought he ruled, the truth was a bitter pill. His phone, just moments before its demise, had buzzed with a text from Chloe. "Babe, my credit card was just declined at Gucci. Fix it. Everyone's staring." That was the moment he knew it was truly over. Thorntech would be bankrupt in less than a week. "In that case, you have to make a deal," his lawyer Sterling had said, his face grim. "Offer her anything she wants. Cash, company stock, a public apology. Because if this goes to court, she has the digital receipts and Adrian Vance's legal team. They will annihilate us." Sterling had just shown him the proof on the conference room screen, a long, elegant string of code with hidden metadata tucked deep inside its kernel. Notes, left by the programmer. "For Brian, so you can finally get some sleep tonight. Love, E." It was from 7 years ago, when he'd been on the verge of failing his finals. He remembered waking from an exhausted sleep on their lumpy couch to find his program, which had been crashing for weeks, running flawlessly. Emma was sitting nearby, a tired smile on her face. She'd just tinkered with it a little, she said. He thought she'd fixed a typo. He never imagined she had rebuilt the entire thing from scratch. "It's worse," Sterling had said, his voice low. "The legal filings show she copyrighted this exact code under the name Ghostwriter 3 days before your company even launched. She's the legal owner, Brian. She's filing for an immediate injunction to shut down your servers." All the blood had drained from his face then. To have his servers shut down, even for an hour, would tank his stock. Permanently, it would mean total ruin. This was the catastrophic end to a nightmare that began just the night before. He'd been trying to get the waiter's attention, desperate to escape the restaurant, when he saw a man in a gray suit approach Adrian's table with legal papers, Brian had felt a sliver of hope. Was the great Adrian Vance in trouble? But the man walked past Adrian and stopped directly at Brian's table. "Are you Brian Thorne?" he'd asked, placing a heavy envelope beside a wine stain. Brian ripped it open. The lawsuit wasn't from Adrian. It was from Emma. The plaintiff was Emma Vance Cross. The charge, theft of intellectual property related to the Thorne algorithmic model, the very foundation of his billion-dollar fortune. In that moment, watching Emma laugh with a billionaire while carrying a child that stood to inherit two fortunes, Brian Thorne felt, for the first time in his life, completely and utterly powerless. It was a feeling that had been building all evening, ever since Adrian Vance had risen to his feet. The billionaire was much taller than Brian, and when he leaned in, his voice was a menacing rumble. "If you dare sue her, bother her, or even look at her again, I will do more than sue you. I'll buy your company, sell it for parts, and leave you with nothing but that cheap suit. Never test me." As guards escorted him away, Brian could only growl, "This isn't over, Emma. You can't keep my child from me." He stumbled back to his table. Chloe's whining about their disrespect, a meaningless buzz in his ear. The confrontation had been ignited by Chloe herself. She had clicked over to their table in her towering heels, clinging to Brian's arm. "Honey, what's taking so long?" she'd complained, her eyes landing on Emma with a smirk. "Oh, it's you. Wow, you've really let yourself go." A dead silence had fallen, but Emma merely offered a slow, pitying smile. "And you must be Chloe. Brian always did have a soft spot for shiny, worthless things. You can have him. He's my throwaway. But a word of advice, read the prenup. He guards his money obsessively." Adrian's dark laugh was the final punctuation before he said, "Marcus, get them out of here." That dismissal was a response to Brian's own desperate, pride-shattering accusation. "It's about the money, isn't it?" he'd snapped. "You left a millionaire for a billionaire. You're nothing but a gold digger." The air had turned glacial. "Be very careful," Adrian had warned, his voice low. "You're speaking to the chairwoman of the Vance Foundation. She rebuilt her life from the ashes you left her in." Emma had gently taken Adrian's hand. "I told him what you were, Brian. The kind of man who had to make me feel small to feel big yourself. And then Adrian came along and showed me I was priceless." But Brian had been blind with rage, convinced he had a claim. "If that's my child, I have rights," he'd hissed, stepping forward. That's when Adrian's voice, without being raised, had frozen him in his tracks. "Sit down, boy." Adrian had swirled the ice in his glass. "You seem to have a few misconceptions. First, you will not raise your voice at my fiancé. It upsets the baby." Fiancé. The word was a punch to the gut. "Second," Adrian continued, his eyes like steel, "you were too busy with your little model to touch your wife for the last year of your marriage. We both know how it was, so don't play the devoted husband now." The scene replayed in his mind. Emma, looking radiant and healthier than he'd ever seen her, her skin glowing with pregnancy. He'd blurted out, "You're pregnant." Her reply was cold, as observant as ever. He'd glanced from Adrian's mocking smile back to Emma's belly. "Is it mine?" he demanded. Emma had let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Yours? Brian, you gave up the right to ask that question the night you threw me out of our house at 11 p.m. because you claimed I lacked vision." And it all began so simply. Brian, standing up from his own table, suddenly resolved. "Don't be long," Chloe had pouted, wanting to order dessert. But Brian paid her no mind. He walked directly toward the private alcove across the dining room, his heart hammering with a mix of pure rage and a strange, desperate hope. As he approached, two large men in dark suits stepped out, blocking his path. "Step aside," Brian demanded, trying to sound like a CEO. "Mr. Vance isn't seeing visitors," one guard said flatly. Then, a deep voice called from the table. "Let him through, Marcus." And as Brian stepped into the alcove, Emma didn't even bother to look up from her menu. The massive hotel doors swung shut, sealing away the sight of the happy family. Emma, Adrian, and their son, Leo, who had just waved a tiny, mittened hand. Brian Thorne stood alone on the freezing sidewalk, the wind whipping around him. In his trembling hand, he clutched a $100 bill, a tip from his ex-wife's new husband. This single piece of paper, once a trivial amount he would use to light a cigar, was now the difference between eating and starving, between warmth and the biting cold. A sob he couldn't contain escaped his chest as he slumped against the building's stone wall, the weight of his new reality crashing down. He had traded true worth for an empire of glitter, and now he had nothing. The papers slipped from his numb fingers, fluttering onto the wet pavement. He wasn't the father. He never could have been. A DNA analysis was attached to the adoption agreement, stating a 0% chance of paternity. Below it, a doctor's note explained a congenital condition from his teenage years rendered him sterile. The truth hit him like a physical blow. Emma's solo work trip to the West Coast a year ago, near Vance Global's main office. She didn't meet Adrian 6 months ago. Their story started long before. The New York rain never washed anything clean. It just made the grime slicker underfoot. He found himself kneeling on the sidewalk. Just moments before, Adrian Vance had calmly placed that folded document into his chest pocket. "Review this when you step outside," he'd said, his smile a chilling mask. Brian had just shot back. "She is not your wife at this moment," his jealousy a raw flame. But Adrian's hand, a steel clamp on his shoulder, held him fast. He had approached them as Brian pleaded with Emma, trying to dislodge her from Adrian's side. The crowd had been watching, enthralled, as this quiet, powerful man moved with surprising swiftness to stand by his wife's side, asking in a low, dangerous tone if Brian was causing her distress. His plea had been a desperate last resort. "What about our child?" he'd begged, grabbing Emma's hand. "You know in your heart that he needs me." A cold, empty smile had formed on her lips. "You really want to discuss the baby, Brian?" At his breathless yes, she raised her voice for all to hear. She spoke of a small gift box he'd swatted from her hands the night he threw her out. Inside, a positive pregnancy test and a pair of baby shoes. She was trying to tell him they were starting a family. But he'd told her to take her garbage and leave. The world had seemed to spin as he stood there, exposed. "Do not stand there acting like you care about being a father," she had seethed. "You turned your back on your own child before you even knew he existed." She told the silent, listening crowd that the baby had a real father now, a man who comforted her, attended every appointment, and built the nursery himself. Brian feebly protested that biology mattered, but his voice was gone. "Biology only makes you the source. Those are yours, Brian," she countered. "It is love that makes a man a father." This public showdown was inevitable from the moment he cornered her. The crowd had parted for him, sensing drama. He had demanded a private word, but she'd refused, her voice devoid of warmth. When he begged, citing the company and the jobs he would lose, her eyes had burned with fury. The woman who rescued stray cats ceased to exist. The night she had to sleep in her car because her husband had all her credit cards canceled, she announced. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. It was a secret he'd prayed would remain buried forever. His defense that he thought she'd gone to her parents fell flat. "My parents passed away, Brian. You knew that, she said, her voice a menacing hush as she stepped closer. Everything had unraveled after her speech. There she was, a majestic figure in a silver maternity gown, looking like a goddess, on the stage near the Temple of Dender. He had come alone, leaving Chloe at home to project an image of regret. But the whispers followed him everywhere. He heard them talking about Thorntech's stock nosediving and Vance Global investing in a rival. He'd been searching the room for an emerald dress, but instead, he found her in starlight silver, addressing the city's most powerful people. And that is why the Vance Foundation is donating $50 million to provide legal assistance for women who have been unfairly treated in their divorce cases. Emma's voice rang out, confident and strong. The applause was deafening, but for Brian, it was the sound of his own ruin. The charity was a direct assault on him. As she descended from the stage, surrounded by admirers, he saw a small opening and pushed his way through, ignoring the icy glares, shouting her name just as security was about to escort her away. Later, after the city lights had blurred into a meaningless smear, he found himself at an exclusive fertility clinic on the Upper East Side. He had stormed in, shouting about medical negligence and fake DNA reports. But the elderly doctor was unimpressed. He simply pulled Brian's medical file from 20 years ago, from a time when a teenage illness had caused severe complications. "I informed your parents at the time, Mr. Thorne," the doctor said, adjusting his glasses. "The internal damage was complete. You have always been incapable of having children. We operated under the assumption that you were aware." Brian wasn't aware, or maybe, deep down, he'd refused to be. For 5 long years, he had made Emma the scapegoat. Every month that passed without a pregnancy, he would sigh with disappointment, make comments about her biological clock, and pressure her into seeing specialists. He let her inject hormones that made her sick and feel like a failure, all while knowing he was the one who was broken. His hands shook as he hailed a cab. He had to get home. He had to face Chloe, the woman he'd won over, with the promise of an empire for their future child. "Where is she now?" Brian had asked Sterling hours earlier, a lifetime ago. "She is the host of the Silver Gala at the Metropolitan Museum tonight," Sterling had replied, mentioning the $20,000 ticket price. "Get me a ticket," Brian had demanded, brushing off Sterling's warning about the restraining order. "I am not going to cause a scene," he'd insisted, completely delusional. "I am just going to remind her that she used to love me. Emma is a compassionate person. I can convince her to stop this." Sterling had looked doubtful, but took out his phone. "I will see what I can do," he'd said. "But Brian, she does not seem very compassionate anymore." What brought him to this cold pavement was a warning delivered less than a week earlier. "Thorntech will be completely broke in less than 7 days, his lawyer, Sterling, had stated grimly. "You have to make a deal." The advice was blunt. Give Emma whatever she demanded: cash, company shares, a public admission of guilt. The alternative was ruin. "She has the digital proof, Brian," Sterling had insisted. "And Adrian Vance's legal team is behind her. They will annihilate us in court." It was a battle he had already lost. As Brian stood by his office window, staring down at the city he thought he owned, his world was unraveling. His phone buzzed with a text from his girlfriend, Chloe. Her card was just declined at a luxury store, and she demanded he fix it immediately. In a fit of rage, Brian threw the phone against the wall, watching it shatter. He was Brian Thorne, a self-proclaimed visionary. He couldn't fail, but the truth was clawing its way to the surface. He was a fraud who had built his entire career on the back of his wife's talent. The broadcast ended with 2 chilling words: "Checkmate, Brian." In the dead silence of his office, Brian Thorne Thorne watched the city lights blur through the glass. Far below, a black SUV pulled to the curb, and he saw a man gently help a woman in a green coat into the vehicle. Even from stories above, the tenderness was obvious. Emma. She hadn't just defeated him. She had utterly erased him. As the silence in the vacant office became a crushing weight, Brian collapsed. His phone buzzed relentlessly. The board, the SEC, the banks, but he ignored them all, his empire vanishing as if it were a dream. He reached into his pocket for the worn photo he'd kept for years. Him and Emma, in their college dorm, broke, sharing a pizza on the floor. They were laughing. He saw a happiness in his own eyes that he hadn't seen since. He realized, in the smoldering wreckage of his life, that he had never been richer than in that moment. But this ruin hadn't come in a single, swift blow. The true dismantling of his life was a slow, agonizing process that began the moment he chose a hollow crown over a shared kingdom. It was all because of the press conference he never saw coming. They'll withdraw the lawsuit, Brian had confidently told his lawyer, Marcus, just an hour earlier, watching the social media storm he'd created. Public opinion was on his side, painting Emma as a gold digger. They'll settle to stop the bad press. But Marcus, his face pale, had pointed to a screen. "You need to see this," he'd stammered. "Vance Global is going live." Brian had swiveled in his chair just in time to see Adrian Vance at a podium, looking not angry, but like a man about to deliver a final judgment. "Today's sake," Adrian began, his voice calm and filling the room. "A desperate man tried to use the media to bully a pregnant woman." He looked directly into the camera. "That man is Brian Thorne." Adrian then stepped aside, and Emma approached the microphone. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a warrior. "I never cheated on Brian Thorne," she said, her voice unshakable. And with that single sentence, Brian's carefully constructed narrative began to crumble into dust. Emma held up a document for the cameras to see. "This is a medical report from the Mayo Clinic," she explained, her voice steady. "It's dated 8 months ago, a month before my divorce. It proves I underwent a round of IVF treatment using a donor." A stunned silence fell over the press corps. "I did this," Emma continued, a slight tremble in her voice, "because my husband desperately wanted a child, but refused to see a doctor. I wanted to surprise him with the family he always said he wanted." The camera zoomed in on her face, capturing a single tear that finally escaped. "I used my own savings. I endured the injections alone," she said. "And on the very same day I found out the treatment was successful, Brian served me with divorce papers." She looked into the lens, as if speaking directly to him. "He threw me out of our home. I was pregnant and alone. Adrian Vance that didn't steal me from you, Brian. You threw me away. He simply picked up the treasure you were too blind to see." That was the truth that had disarmed him. But it was what came next that destroyed him. Adrian returned to the microphone. "Mr. Thorne also forgot one detail about the software he built his company on," he said with a cold smile. "Emma didn't just write the code. She protected it." As Adrian spoke of a hidden kill switch designed to activate if the core files were altered, Brian's blood ran cold. His IT team had done exactly that morning, trying to hide his theft. "The kill switch activates," Adrian said, glancing at his watch. "In 3, 2, Shomon." And Brian's world went dark. But this chain of events was set in motion by his own hand, by a single, vengeful phone call. Before the press conference, before the world knew the truth, Brian had been the one pulling the strings. Fueled by a dark, satisfying rage, he had dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Barry," he'd said to the sleazy reporter, his voice like ice, "I have a big story for you." He laid out a twisted tale of a billionaire who poached another man's wife, of a saintly woman pregnant with another man's child while still married. "The baby is all the proof you need," Brian had lied. Publish it. Destroyer. He hung up, certain that if he was going down, he would drag them all down with him. His fury had been born in his lavish penthouse, drenched from the rain and surrounded by chaos. He'd found Chloe on the couch, screaming into her phone. "I don't care that the card was rejected," she'd shrieked. "Try it again." When she saw him, her only thought was for the money. "Brian, fix my credit card. This is so embarrassing." In that moment, he saw her clearly for the first time. A beautiful, hollow shell. "Chloe," he said calmly, "it's time for you to pack." Her mocking laughter had echoed off the marble floors. "You can't be serious," she'd sneered after he kicked a designer box across the room. "You can't just throw me out like you did your ex-wife." The mention of Emma was a blade to the gut. "Fine," Chloe had screamed, sweeping jewelry from a table. "You're no fun anyway, and just so you know, everyone makes fun of you. You're just a bank account on legs, and I hear you're about to be a poor one." She had slammed the door, leaving him alone with her poisonous words. Left in the echoing silence of the penthouse, Brian poured a stiff drink. The grief over his failed marriage began to curdle into a vicious, cold rage. Emma had to have known, he thought. If she was pregnant and the baby wasn't his, because he knew he was sterile, it could only mean one thing: betrayal. The timeline tormented him. They had been divorced for 6 months, but she was 7 months pregnant. She must have been with another man while they were still married. A dark, unhinged laugh escaped his lips. The perfect, saintly Emma was a cheater. The woman who acted so flawless had betrayed him under his own roof. It was this singular, poison-laced thought, born of his own deep-seated insecurities and total ignorance of her private sacrifice, that sealed his fate. He picked up his phone, his mind set on a revenge that would ultimately consume him whole. And so it all began. With a businesslike kindness he couldn't possibly know was a final, crushing blow, Adrian tucked the bill into the valet's hand. "Stay warm," he said, turning his back to lead his family into the hotel's private entrance. Brian watched them go, the warmth and golden light swallowing them whole. He glanced down at the crisp, new $100 bill in his trembling palm. Benjamin Franklin's face seemed to mock him. "Thank you, sir," Brian whispered, the sound so broken and raspy he barely recognized his own voice as it was snatched away by the wind. 3 years had passed since the downfall. Brian stood on a Chicago sidewalk, the brutal lake wind cutting through his cheap polyester uniform like a knife. He was no longer Brian Thorne, the tech genius. He was Jules, the rock-bottom valet at the Grand Plaza Hotel. "Hey, Jules, wake up!" Manny, his 20-year-old captain, yelled through a cloud of vapor. Manny, who spent his shifts on TikTok, had no idea who he was talking to. To him, Brian was just the slow, quiet old guy with shaky hands. 5 years earlier, he had been the main event. At this exact gala, he was the keynote speaker, bathed in a spotlight so hot and bright it felt like the sun. He remembered the roar of applause after he spoke of vision and disruption. He remembered Emma in the front row, her hands folded, looking up at him with a pride he now realized was entirely unearned. That night, she wore a simple blue dress because he'd called the designer gown she loved too ostentatious. Tonight, he wasn't a speaker. He was the help. The routine was its own special kind of torture. Fetch the car. Accept a $2 tip without a word. Watch the ghost of your past life drive away. He'd done it just minutes before when Marcus Sterling, his former lawyer, handed him a ticket for a Mercedes without a flicker of recognition. Brian had kept his head bowed, the brim of his cap pulled low to hide his face. It was hell to be invisible in a world you once ruled. "Heads up," Manny hissed, snapping him back to reality. Whale coming in. Blacked out Escalade. That's the Vance detail. Vance. The name was like a cattle prod to his heart. Brian's breath hitched. His feet felt glued to the frozen pavement, held fast by a sickening mix of dread and morbid curiosity. The massive SUV, flanked by security cars, was less a vehicle and more a mobile fortress. Its powerful engine hummed, a vibration that rattled his teeth. "Jules, get the door!" Manny barked, distracted by a socialite. Brian moved forward, his hands trembling so violently he had to clasp them behind his back to still them. He saw his reflection in the tinted window, a hollow-eyed stranger, aged 20 years, in 3. As he pulled the heavy handle, a wave of warmth, smelling of leather and jasmine, washed over him. He saw a handmade Italian shoe first. Then, Adrian Vance emerged, broader and more formidable than Brian remembered. He moved with the effortless confidence of a man who owned the world. Adrian didn't even glance at the valet. He turned back, extending a hand. "Careful, love. It's icy." A hand took his, a hand Brian knew better than his own, a hand he remembered washing dishes in their first apartment. Emma stepped out. The air left his lungs. The timid woman he remembered was gone, replaced by a queen draped in deep crimson velvet and a coat like soft snow. Diamonds sparkled at her throat, elegant, timeless stones, nothing like the flashy jewels Chloe had demanded. But it wasn't the clothes. It was her face. The worry lines were gone, replaced by a deep serenity that made her glow. She looked cherished. She looked happy. "Wait for me?" A small voice called from inside the car. A little boy, no older than 3, bundled in a tiny peacoat, scrambled to the edge of the seat. Adrian let out a deep, joyful laugh and easily scooped the child onto his hip. "Didn't forget you, champ." The boy, Leo, wrapped his arms around Adrian's neck. "Daddy, did you see the robot with lasers?" he asked excitedly. "I sure did," Adrian replied, kissing his head. "But I think you like the dessert table more," Emma chuckled, brushing a snowflake from the boy's nose. "You're 100% your father's son," she said. Your father's son. The words echoed in the empty chasm of Brian's soul. Leo was not his. The DNA test had been the final nail in his coffin, a genetic dead end. All his speeches about dynasty and legacy had been a sham. The real legacy stood right before him, a happy child raised by a man who commanded respect without ever having to demand it. Suddenly the boy noticed him. Leo's eyes met Brian's, and in them there was no judgment. He didn't see a failure or a liar. He just saw a man in a funny hat. "Hi," Leo said, waving a mittened hand. That simple word shattered the last of Brian's composure. Hot tears stung his eyes. He tried to speak, but his throat was sealed shut. Emma followed her son's gaze, and her eyes landed on the valet. Recognition dawned slowly. She didn't gasp or recoil. Her eyes just widened slightly as she took in the cheap uniform, the soaked shoes, the name tag that read Jules. Her expression softened into a look of profound soul-crushing sadness. The kind of look you give a stray you can't save. It was pure, detached pity. Without a word, she turned back to her family. "Adrian, let's get Leo inside," she said quietly. "He's starting to shiver." This whole nightmare was set in motion the day Chloe left him. She stood there as a man in a cheap windbreaker handled Brian's Patek Philippe, the watch he bought with his first 10 million, and dropped it into an evidence bag like a cheap toy. She hadn't packed a single thing. She'd simply called an Uber, looked at him with eyes devoid of any emotion, and delivered the final verdict. "You're bad for my brand, Brian." That was how it all began. The business's collapse was just the tip of the iceberg. The real poison was a lie he had nurtured for 5 long years. As he wandered through a downpour just days before, his expensive shoes ruined in puddles, he was haunted by the memory of his cruelty. Every month Emma didn't conceive, he had met her with a disappointed sigh, a pointed look, a casual remark about her biological clock. He had systematically convinced her that she was the problem. He had pushed her to consult with specialists, encouraged her to take hormones that ravaged her body, and shamed her when the treatments failed. He had made her carry the burden of a failure that was never hers to begin with. All that time, he was the one who was broken. As he finally hailed a cab, his hands shaking, a single thought electrified him. Chloe, she was with him for the empire he had promised, an empire that was now turning to dust because of a truth he could no longer escape. The truth had hit him like a physical blow in front of an exclusive fertility clinic on the Upper East Side. He had charged in, demanding answers, shouting about a fake DNA report for the child, and threatening a lawsuit for malpractice. He was a storm of wealthy entitlement, but the doctor, an older man unfazed by such displays, was not moved in the slightest. The doctor simply retrieved Brian's own medical records, a file dating back 20 years. It detailed a serious illness from his teenage years that had caused irreversible internal damage. "I informed your parents at the time, Mr. Thorne," the doctor said, adjusting his glasses. "The damage was absolute. You have always been incapable of having children." It was a truth he had either never been told or had willfully buried so deep that he convinced himself it was a lie. And that's how it all began. The downfall wasn't sparked by a single event, but by a man who designed his own prison. He wasted his life chasing wealth and status, never understanding true value. Brian Thorne tossed away the only diamond he ever had in his obsessive pursuit of glitter. By the time he realized his mistake, that diamond was already shining in another man's crown. Sometimes, the cruelest karma isn't what happens to you, but what you are forced to live without. Brian Thorne didn't get the family, the love, or the legacy. He just got a tip. What do you all think? Was that final look of pity from Emma more cutting than any angry words could have been? Is being erased from someone's life the ultimate revenge? If you were Emma, would you have confronted him? Or was walking away the most powerful choice she could make? Let's start a discussion below. If this story gave you chills, please hit that like button to help YouTube share it with more people. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss another drama. Thanks for watching, and remember, be kind to those you meet on the way up, because you'll surely meet them on your way back down. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.